Understanding and configuring PPPoE. Can you believe that nearly 20 years ago now, I was teaching my first technical class to a classroom full of telephony technicians? And when I say telephony, I'm not talking voice over IP, I'm talking people climbing telephone poles, talking about this brand new technology called DSL. And the whole goal of my 2-day class was to teach them how to install a network card inside of a Windows 3.1 or Windows 95 computers and all the IRQ conflicts and DMA channels. Oh, those were the days. Anytime I can see a slide that takes me back to those days, I love it. And that's what this slide does for me. DSL connectivity is all about essentially the telephony provider or telco providing high-speed internet over existing copper wires. Here's how it works. This is a slide grabbed straight from Wikipedia. Actually, this is a slide straight from my CCNA service provider series, where I go through how to build a service provider in 2 series or less. It's pretty awesome. So anyway, you've got the carrier who is connected to the internet. You know, essentially they've got their own data center, they've got their own uplink connections to all the other carriers. It essentially runs across fiber optic cabling to something called a DSLAM. So if I were to draw this in a little more reality, a DSLAM, or essentially a central office of a telco provider, is sometimes big, sometimes old, dusty equipment that connects to a neighborhood in this big thing called a local loop. Essentially, it's a giant copper connection that has been used for years and years and years for telephone equipment, now being adopted to run essentially high-speed internet, right? Well, as they are using that big copper line, they have taps coming off that goes to all of these houses that essentially is a big shared media. As a matter of fact, some very old people might remember, I don't know a better way to say that, might remember the old party lines, which was how the telco originated, where if somebody was essentially using the phone, you would pick up the line and be like, oh, sorry, I didn't know you were on the phone, and hang up, and you'd actually have to wait because this was one big shared line before the telephone company figured out how to divide it up into individual frequencies for the houses to make their telephone calls. Nonetheless, I digress, but it's very relevant for PPPoE because essentially the telephone company has turned this giant local copper loop into a big old Ethernet cable, right? Where all these people are tapping into that Ethernet cable and getting their high-speed DSL from it. Well, if it's a big shared Ethernet connection, then how do you differentiate? How do you make sure that this person over here can't steal high-speed internet service by just, you know, doing a little jimmy rigging at their house and plugging this into a DSL modem and tapping essentially into that connection? Well, the answer to that is PPP over Ethernet. Essentially, we take an Ethernet line and add the capabilities of PPP. The main one that we're interested is, you probably guessed it, authentication, right? Allowing these people to plug in a router that must first authenticate to this DSLAM, to this device right here, and say, yes, here's my username and password, which the only way I would have received that is by the carrier essentially giving it to me, meaning I'm paying them for a connection, and that grants me essentially access to that DSL connection and even provisions my modem further to do the correct speeds and all, etc., etc. Essentially everything that DSL provides. So with that introduction, you can imagine my surprise when I saw PPPoE show up on the brand new route exam objectives. I thought, that's not a route concept. What's that doing here? That's more service provider, kind of maybe end user-ish sort of thing. And I sat down and started thinking, I'm like, you know, here's what's probably happening. DSL has proven itself. Businesses are starting to adopt this as a valid internet connection for their business. Maybe it's a backup, maybe it's a primary. Either way, we now have to configure our Cisco routers to do PPPoE authentication so that they can route to the internet. Now I see why it's a good miscellaneous objective for this series, right? So PPP has 2 distinct phases, PPPoE, discovery and session. Discovery is essentially the Cisco router sending out a broadcast saying, hello, who's out there? It does that through a special kind of message called a PADI. I'm serious. I'm not talking Star Wars, Padawan learner, anything like that. And the DSLAM, or essentially the controller out there, receives it and sends back a PADO. Essentially, that's a PPPoE active discovery initiation and active discovery offer. Essentially, this is just a way to set up the session with the server, right? As a matter of fact, when I was looking for information on this, I forgot I actually taught this years ago when Cisco, back before there was route, switch, and T-shoot in the CCNP series, it used to be ISCW, what was it? Other stuff. There was a totally different version of CCNP that existed long ago, and I actually did a full configuration of a PPPoE DSL connection in the ISCW course. I did debugs, everything. So if you really want to see what happens with the Paddo dance, I watched myself and I learned something that I had forgotten from years ago by going to view that video. So that one's out there for you if you want to take a look at it. But Paddy is where it discovers it. The session is where the PPPoE client actually negotiates options, and the key authenticates to the server, receives an IP address, and now is able to use that to route. Back in this video, I showed the old way of doing this, which involves creating a dialer interface because it sees PPPoE as kind of like a dial-up connection, and it uses that dialer interface to authenticate and all that. Cisco has made it much easier in the modern day. You go to global config mode, type in VPDN enable, which enables essentially the VPDN process. It's essentially the same kind of thing. It treats it kind of dial-up-ish, right? You then say, okay, I'm going to create a VPDN group, and this is just the name of the group, CBT Nuggets, and I'm going to dial out with that group using PPPoE. You then follow up that command by choosing the authentication method. For instance, CHAP is encrypted, PAP is clear text, right? Then you go in and say, okay, I want to authenticate using the local name Ninja. Now, you're obviously going to use whatever name the carrier has given you to authenticate to that PPPoE connection, right? Normally, it actually is an email address, or it looks like an email address anyway. So then I go and say, okay, well, the username Ninja, or again, whatever they've given you to authenticate with, will actually have the password of Secret Ninja, or whatever password they give you. And I would highly recommend adding this store local to it. What that does is store that in the NVRAM so that if the carrier ever tries to clear it out, because they can, once you authenticate to that server has some level of control over your router because it provisions it, right? And they can actually send a clear message that wipes that out of your configuration unless you add the store local in there, which says that's going to be stored in the NVRAM, and I will put it back if the DSL provider tries to clear that out. From there, essentially, that's the global configuration. Nope, include that in the router. Then you go under the interface, whichever interface you've connected to the DSL provider, and type in IP address PPPoE set route. What that does is say whatever IP address you negotiate in this little session negotiation phase, this one right here, set that as the IP address of the fast Ethernet or whatever interface you've connected to the provider. And this, by the way, is an optional command, and use the default route. You usually want that. Whatever route they've given you via that IP address assignment, set that as your default route so that your router can route out to the internet, right? You then attach all this configuration to the interface so that it knows how and what to authenticate with using this PPPoE client VPDN group, and then type in your group name. Definitely has a miscellaneous protocol feel to it, doesn't it? It's just something that landed into the route series. So that is both the modern configuration and a little behind the scenes of how PPPoE works. I encourage you, if you really are interested, and if you want to hear Jeremy from probably 8 years ago, go listen to that video I recommend from the ISCW course. For now, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.